enlightening episode of The Truth About the Plant, the show that takes you on a journey through the world of psychoactive plants and alternative wellness, all while delivering the real actionable insights you crave. I'm your host, Christina Dees. This is my equally talented co-host, Dr. Amanda Ryman. Dr. Ryman, would you do the honors and tell them why we are here?
Absolutely. So we are here because when it comes to finding good scientifically backed information about cannabis, Google is not your friend. You can go on and Google a question about cannabis and get 100 different answers, many of which contradict each other. And finding the real info, the science-backed info, can be really, really difficult. So we're here to do all of that for you in 15 minutes or less, give you actionable information that you can take out there and incorporate into your relationship with cannabis. So think of us as your kick-ass granddaughters or your really cool aunties who are always going to tell you the truth.
Well, get ready as we answer a burning inquiry that sparked countless of debates and even raised a few eyebrows. Does the green goddess Mary Jane induce laziness? Join us as we delve into the haze of stereotypes and scientific scrutiny to uncover the truth behind the age-old question in this episode: does pot make you lazy? Well, when I was growing up, the going claim was that if I smoked pot, I would go nowhere in life. Do you have any idea where this came from?
Yeah. So this idea that people who use cannabis are less than or not contributing to society was actually tied to certain groups by those in power who had an interest in disparaging these groups. So they wanted the general public to think that these folks were not going to contribute to society, that they were actually a drain on society, and that this was because their use of cannabis. So going all the way back to the beginning, and seeing groups like Mexican immigrants, this claim was often made about, and then going through artists and musicians. And then the 1960s and 70s, it was middle-class American kids, really teens, who were hippies and whose parents were told that they weren't going to amount to anything if they used cannabis. So these claims were really to convince the good, upstanding citizens of America that people who use cannabis were a drain on society. So Americans, they really value hard work. They value contribution. So the idea that cannabis consumers could not contribute, that they weren't interested in hard work, made the groups who used cannabis seem inferior.
Well, parents are also people in power, yes? So how
Yes.
did this messaging affect them?
Well, for many middle-class American parents, the idea that your child will amount to nothing and not contribute to society is maybe their biggest fear, right? Parents want their kids to be productive members of society. They want them to have jobs. They want them to do well in school. And so this threat that using cannabis was somehow going to take all of this away really spoke to the hearts and the minds of the average American parent. Now, back in the day, the claim around cannabis was that cannabis would make you into a violent criminal. And this kind of rhetoric really didn't fly with a lot of parents. They knew their kids and they may think that, okay, I don't want them to be lazy. I don't want them to be unemployed. I don't want them to just sit around, but I don't believe they're going to become a violent criminal. I mean, that would change the very nature of who they were. So a message that really struck fear in them and was believable was not the idea that cannabis is going to make your kid pick up a knife and stab someone. It was that cannabis is going to make your kid lose all interest in being motivated, lose all interest in achievement, that cannabis would make their kids losers, and no parent wanted that.
The power of fear. So how was this message spread?
Well, one way that this message was spread was through government-supported propaganda like the DARE program. So, DARE came around in the 1980s. It was the only federally funded drug education program. And so a lot of messaging around what it meant to use drugs, including cannabis, came through DARE. And so they actually created a whole medical condition. You may remember this from back in the day, called amotivational syndrome. And the idea was that people that used cannabis caught amotivational syndrome, which means that they lost all motivation and care in achievement, in doing well in school, that they wanted to just sit on the couch in a cloud of cannabis smoke. And a lot of parents really bought into this idea. And this idea was then spread through programs like DARE. You also may remember a public service announcement that came out in kind of the late 80s with McGruff the crime dog, where he was like in a park with a piano and there were a bunch of kids circled around him singing this song about how users were losers and losers were users. So the messaging there wasn't that drugs made you crazy. It wasn't that drugs made you violent. It wasn't even that drugs made you addictive. It was that drugs made you a loser. And this was a very common message for young kids because nobody wanted to be called a loser, right? And then there was this final influence that's really interesting about how cannabis consumers were portrayed in movies. So when you look back to movies, the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s and the early 2000s, there was kind of this cannabis consumer stereotype who was this stoned character who was funny, but who was out of it and no one took them seriously. And they were usually in 12th grade for like the third time. And they were doing kind of these silly things, but no one knew thought they were really going to go anywhere in life. And there was this caricature of a stone person. So, you might remember Jeff Spicoli and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, all of the Cheech and Chong movies, pretty much. Matthew McConaughey's character in Dazed and Confused. There are so many examples of that typical stupid stoner stereotype. And it was really only recently that you started to see movies and television shows show characters that had jobs, that were smart, that were motivated, who also happened to use cannabis, and where cannabis was really just another thing that they did, like having a glass of wine, rather than it be such a central part of who they were as a person.
So, is there any truth to this? Like, does cannabis make you lazy?
Well, I mean, overall, no. I mean, I could sit here and rattle off examples of people who use cannabis who are Olympic athletes and, founded one of some of the biggest companies in the world and are scientists that have amazing brains. So no, using cannabis does not turn you into a person who is not motivated and not smart if you are a person who is already motivated and already smart. Now, yes, using cannabis can make you relaxed. It can result in spending some time on the couch watching Netflix, but it doesn't fundamentally change who you are as a person. Now, something that kind of muddies this is that there are people out there that use cannabis for depression and for other mental health issues. And these mental health issues do impact motivation. But the effects of the cannabis aren't the same as the effects of these symptoms of mental health. So it's possible that someone might be using cannabis to escape their problems, but the underlying problems are more likely to impact personal success than motivation. So if you're somebody that experiences depression, some of the symptoms of depression are lack of motivation, sleeping a lot, having trouble finding joy in activities, not having the energy to go out and do things. And you may be using cannabis to address some of these symptoms of depression. And so from the outside, it could look like cannabis is the thing that's causing those symptoms when it's really the underlying depression.
Well, let's go back to the parenting topic for just a second because I have kids, and of course, I want to delay them using any psychoactive substance as long as possible. Is there a higher risk for teens who use pot to develop issues related to motivation?
I mean, it is possible. And this is why we want teens to delay their use as long as they can, ideally until they're adults, at least in their early to mid 20s. Teens deal with a lot, including hormonal changes, and that can impact their mood and behavior. And adding cannabis to the mix might exacerbate these changes or create feelings they may not be able to handle. And that may cause them to shut down. So you're kind of taking this being that is like a swirling hotbed mix of hormones and emotions and experiences and developmental, things going on. And then you add something like cannabis to the mix, and it definitely can interrupt those processes and those changes. And it also can make teens avoid really getting to the bottom of what's bothering them. And that's really the best way to go about it, right? Is to get to the bottom of what is that underlying issue. So having open and honest conversations about these risks while not jumping to punishment is recommended. We have a whole episode on that, which can be very difficult because, again, parents have really been ingrained with this idea that if your kid is using cannabis, they're on a one-way ticket to Loserville. And no parent wants that for their kid, not for their own sake, not for the sake of their kid. So it can be really easy to just kind of react to that and want to clamp down and like keep the kid in their room and not let them talk to anybody, and think that if you can completely control their environment, you will completely control their cannabis use. But what's a better approach is really to talk to them and find out why they feel the need to use cannabis. What emotion are they experiencing that might make them more likely to use something like cannabis? Where are they getting it? Is what they're getting safe? We have a whole other episode on Delta 8 that I recommend people watch. But the idea is that as a teen, cannabis can absolutely interrupt some of these normal processes of feeling and experiencing feelings. When it comes to adults, unless you're treating a certain mental health condition with cannabis, that presents as something that includes lack of motivation, sleeping a lot, things like depression, then cannabis on its own is not going to rob you of your motivation to lead a successful life.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, not to wait until you do find something, right? To have a conversation, and that conversations are uncomfortable. But find a way to have a real world conversation with your kids if you have them, or if you have nieces and nephews too, because it is happening out there, and kids are confused. They're going to be curious. It's going to happen, and peer pressure is a thing too. So I think having these real world, honest conversations up front, so that they know they have a safe place to come to, if they do genuinely need to talk about it. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And opening up those lines of communication and helping them better understand the relationship between their moods and the desire to use something like cannabis just means that as they get older, they're going to be able to develop that healthy relationship with cannabis, because they're going to be able to separate out how they're feeling and the vulnerabilities of how they're feeling with kind of the temptation of the quick fix of self-medication.
yeah, 100%. All right. Well, as we extinguish the embers on this blazing debate, remember, the truth about the plants, like cannabis, may surprise you. So keep the conversation smoldering by sharing your thoughts with us. You can always drop us your burning question at info@mypersonalplants.com. And if you're hungry for more thought-provoking discussions and cannabis conundrums, don't just sit there. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the button, stoke the flames of curiosity with each new episode. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and stay lit with curiosity. We'll see you then.